Hey guys, this video is going to be about how I bet $225,000 on the recent presidential election, and I'm also going to give my results. I'm going to see how we did at the end as you're sort of looking at the state totals here on the New York Times webpage. And I'm going to go over a little bit about how I decided to bet on certain states and what I thought the value was. So what I'm always going to be pointing to here and where I got most of my data and sort of where I got most of my kind of faith in modeling and how I basically placed a lot of bets was over on 538.com and their election modeling, which is basically put out by Nate Silver. And he got a lot of flack about his modeling. And what I will say about his modeling, which just, the general public just doesn't seem to really understand, but me as a professional gambler, I get it. He is not a pollster. Basically, he is making projections based upon polls, and he weights the polls that he uses based upon how good he thinks, the polls are, their accuracy. But that's not the only thing that goes into his modeling. Also, what goes into his modeling is historical trends, like voter correlation, things like that. And he was actually a lot more, I would say, bullish on Trump than other modeling, like The Economist. So if you take a look here, you see that he had basically Biden winning 89 out of 100 different simulations that he did. Now, the thing that is the most important part of this, which people don't understand, is it doesn't make any difference if the election was close in people's eyes or not. There are two results here. They're binary. Either Biden wins or Trump wins. So when he's making this projection, the fact that Biden is going to win means that his projection falls into this 89 out of 100. And the way that he did this projection is that he would account for a lot of polling errors. One of the states that we're going to take a look at that had a pretty large polling error was Wisconsin. So he had Biden winning Wisconsin 94 out of 100 times. Now, if you look at the polling averages here, you can see that he weighted some of the polls and he had the polling averages at 8.4%. So, Biden was supposed to be up by 8.4%. If we actually look at what ended up happening, which is here, Wisconsin, see, he's got the polling average plus the actual result was +1. So the polls or his weighting polling average was off by -7. But that was accounted for in the model, meaning that he said Wisconsin was going to win 94 out of 100 times. And in order for Trump to win the 6 out of 100 times, the polling error would have to be so massive, probably like one of the largest in the history of polling. And it was a large polling error, but Biden still won. So that's the thing. It doesn't matter if Biden won by 20 points or if Biden won by 1 point. These are all the different simulations. Wherever this little dot is where the actual one came in, he still won. So that falls into the 94 out of 100. It's correct. And that's why I think that the modeling is fairly strong. So let's take a look back at the national and when the election was basically going on, as we'll talk about a little bit. People all over social media was like, "You're done, Nate Silver. This is the last time you'll ever model again." And of course, me as a gambler and playing poker, I know that 1 out of 10 happens all the time. I mean, it's not really a rare occurrence. But the point here is that it didn't happen, and it doesn't matter if in some people's eyes the election was close. And back in 2016, he actually had a model that said that, Hillary was going to win 72 out of 100 times. So Trump hit at that 28 out of 100. So if we put 100 numbers in a hat and you got numbers 90 through 100 and I got numbers 1 through 89 and you got to draw out of the hat one time and you drew 89, that doesn't mean that you were close to winning. You weren't any more close to winning than if you had drawn number 1. Now, the fact that Biden's going to win still doesn't even prove that the projection is accurate. We don't have the luxury of running this exact election over and over again. So some people are like, "Oh, Biden won, Nate Silver was right." Not necessarily. I mean, the modeling is saying that Biden's going to win 90 out of 100 times. So historically, we have a situation where we have Trump winning 28 out of 100 in 2016, and then we have another sample where Biden was supposed to win 89 out of 100, and he won. I'm sure that Nate Silver is going to be the first to tell you that it's just a probability, and his numbers are all based upon his model, which he weights polls based upon, his analytics of how accurate the polls have been historically, how partisan or nonpartisan that they are, voting trends in a geographical area, and also historical trends in that area. In actuality, the election is not as close as people actually think that it is. But that's where a lot of people go wrong with this Nate Silver stuff. He's not a pollster. He weights the data that he receives, and he has a lot of other stuff that goes into his modeling. And I think one of the more important things too is that if you don't believe his modeling, or if you don't believe the polls, you have to acknowledge that at least that there is some data behind those numbers, as opposed to what Nate Silver likes to call like hot takes, where you're not using any data whatsoever. So going into that as a gambler, that's how I basically attacked it. Even if his modeling isn't 100% accurate, or even if it's not all that accurate, it's better than nothing. And I'm looking for information basically to beat the betting markets. Now let's take a look over here at the total results that I had for the entire bets. Here are all my bets here, and you can see these are the states that I pushed hard. So I bet $209,000. This is my single bets. I bet with a friend too a little bit, and then I bet a little bit on Predict It, and that will result here. Total bets of $209,136. If I won them all, I would win $218 on top of I'd get my money back. And then the outcome was $211,238. So I actually only ended up winning about $2,000 on $209,000 in bets, which is really kind of like pennies, right? But you can see that I bet $39,000 on the national, which is obviously going to come in, but I also bet $15,300 on Ohio, $10,000 on Texas, Iowa, Florida, and Alaska, $57,000 on basically sort of these long shots, which I didn't really think were long shots. They were more like close to flips, or Biden being slightly favored, getting a good price. And of course, my outcome was zero. I mean, Georgia's going to help me quite a bit because I'm going to I'm going to win $12,950 there. But that's the total money won. That's the total money bet. I won $2,102 when I had 100% of myself. In my betting with a friend, we won $46.64, which I had half of, and then I lost $1,000 on Predict It. So my absolute total for this election was $3,934. That is my grand total basically for winning. But that's how I basically went about and calculated it. Now here, I took a look at how much money, if you had basically just put in on October 1st, $210,000, I won the, $39.34, which is a 1.7% return. If I had put it in an S&P index fund, I would have gotten about $10,000, which is about 7.8% return since October 1st. And Bitcoin, which basically has taken off in the last 60 days, if I had put that money in Bitcoin and sold it, I would be up 90,000 for a 40% return. Obviously, that's just a little bit of fun looking at statistics, but I have yet to be graded on a lot of these bets from these different sites. So a lot of the money is still tied up. The national has not been graded. Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin really haven't been graded either. So I'm waiting for a lot of that money basically to come back. So let's go over to sort of what my master, I call this like my presidential sheet. I made a Google Sheet sort of spreadsheet, and I basically took the readily most available lines or the markets, the sports betting. These are offshore books that I could bet on, and I funded them all through Bitcoin, which is another thing that made this very, very easy to bet on in 2020 versus 2016, because you can get money in and out on Bitcoin very easily. Bookmaker, Bovada, MyBookie, BetOnline, BetAnySports, and also ACR and some of these other ones here too. Now, for those of you that don't understand American odds, I'll just give you a very, very brief tutorial. Basically, when you see a negative line. So say something is minus 150. What that means is that you have to put up $150 to win $100. If a line is plus 150, you have to put up $100 to win $150. Now, for the purposes of this, I didn't use positive and negative numbers, but the blue is all negative. So Arizona here, the line is actually minus 138, and the red is positive because I was betting on Biden. So for example, Georgia here is plus 162. So if I bet $100 on a line of plus 1027, I'm betting 100 to win 1027. If I'm betting, well, if I want to win $100 on a line of minus 1338, I have to put in 1338 to win $100. I'm laying about 13.3 to 1. A lot of people look at that stuff and they're a little bit intimidated, but that's all American odds. That's all it means is based upon a $100 bet. If it's minus, you have to put this up to win 100, and if it's plus, you are putting up 100 to win the plus amount. So what I did, and this is actually the final model on 11.3 because he stopped the model. Nate Silver basically stopped the model. So what I did was I made a column with what his probabilities were for each particular state. So for example, Florida, at the end he had Biden winning 69 out of 100 times. So I would put that in here as 69, and I'd go down the list for all the different states, and I would basically put his percentage of Biden winning because that's where all the value was. It was on the Biden market. I would then look at the American money line on all of these particular sites, and I would, in a mathematical formula, convert that to a probability. I would see how far the probabilities were apart, and that's how I would basically calculate my expected value. Now, Florida was a little bit weird because Nate Silver had Florida as Biden as a favorite, and most of the books at election time had him as a dog. But for the purposes of this, the blue numbers are negative, meaning that Biden's favorite, and the reds are positive. So, for example, let's take a look at a rather simple one, which I had a lot of money on. So Michigan here, Nate Silver had as 95 out of 100. On Bookmaker, Michigan was minus 361. So I had a calculation, and one of the things, the easiest things that you can do in American, sports betting is you can convert that to a number out of 100. And what you do is basically you take the betting line, you add 100 to it, and then you divide. So to find 78, it's 361 plus 100 divided by 361, and that will basically get you the probability. So we have this betting market that's saying that Biden's going to win 78 out of 100 times, and then we have Nate Silver saying that Biden's going to win 95 out of 100 times. And the way that you find your EV is you subtract 95 from 78, and then you divide that number by the betting line, and you get 21. So that's exactly what this is. It's 95 minus 78 divided by 78, and you get your expected EV, which is 21% if you believe the modeling. Now, what does that mean? It means that for every $100 you bet, you would return, according to the Nate Silver modeling, $21. And you can prove that by basically running the bet out 10 times, 100 times. You can look at, we can take a look at a very, very simple example. So for here, we had these were the best, basically, markets. These states had the most EV. These had all of them or a lot of them, but these are the ones that I found were, basically showed the most kind of return. So here's a sample, and I'm going to pull a calculator up and I'll show you. So we can actually play this out by looking at the bet 100 times, and that proves the EV. So if we have to lay minus 150 to win 100, and we're going to bet 100 times on that, you can see that the total bet is going to be $15,000 total, right? Now, according to Nate Silver model, we're going to win the bet 66 times. So 66 times we win $100. We win 6,600. 34 times we're going to lose 150. So 34 times 150 equals $5,100. 6,600 minus 5,100 equals a net of $1,500, and our total bet was 15,000. So we end up with the 10% EV right there. So for every 15,000 that we put up, we're going to win $1,500. And that works for all of these numbers, no matter what. Now let's take a look at a really extreme example where I was really pressing Florida, sometimes Iowa, and Ohio, where the modeling said that it was really not that, that Biden really wasn't that far behind, but I was getting an incredible price. The most extreme example being Florida. So this red indicates that Biden was getting a price. So in American money lines, it was plus 196. So, but Nate Silver had Florida winning 69 times. So let's run that out 100 times. So we're betting $100 to win $196 100 times. So we're only betting $10,000 here because we're not laying a price. But when we win each bet, we get $196. So Florida 69 times 196 would mean that we're winning $13,524. Now we're losing the other 31 times, but we're only betting $100, so minus 3,100. And we would get a net profit of $10,424 on 10,000. And you can see that we've got our 1.0424% EV. Now let's take a look at Iowa. So here, Iowa, Nate Silver had Biden winning 40 out of 100 times. On the bookmaker line, we could get plus 328. Plus 328. So that means that we're betting $10,000 again, and 40 times, according to Nate Silver, we're going to win $328, which is 13,120. And then we're going to lose $100 60 times, so minus 6,000, and we get a profit of 7120, and we divide that by our total bet, and we're going to get our EV of 71%. So that's how I basically attacked everything. I looked at the modeling, the Nate Silver modeling. I transferred or basically made the money line a probability. And then I found the EV, and I pushed hard in Alaska. I pushed hard in Florida, fairly hard in Georgia, Iowa, Ohio, and Texas too was another big state that I thought was incredible for like an incredible line. For example, here, Montana, I had some money on Montana. Nate Silver said that Montana was 18 out of 100 to win. I got plus 1083, which equates to 8 out of 100, and the EV was 113%. You're like, oh my God, let's lay down on Montana. That's the highest EV play. Well, it's only going to hit, less than say 1 out of 5 times. Now, what's interesting here, and what I actually figured out just by going through basically, this entire process, is that I got in really, really good one day on a site called Bet Online on some what I like to call long lays, which basically was like Massachusetts. I got in at minus 1,400, which means that I was able to put down $7,000 to win $500, right? Now, even if the probability of Massachusetts, Biden winning Massachusetts by, let's say it's 100%, the money line equates to 93 out of 100 times. I have it at 99.9, but let's say it was 100, right? The EV on that bet is only 7%. So I'm making about $493 on the $7,000 bet, almost as a guarantee, but the actual EV is only 7%. Whereas if you look at Iowa here, where the money line was 328, and Nate Silver had Iowa at 40 out of 100, and the money line equated to 23 out of 100, the EV is 71%. And I was making $24.92 on a $3,500 bet. Of course, Iowa didn't come in, but Massachusetts did come in. And it was interesting because you tie up capital when you make some of these long lays, because, I made the bet in early October. It was pretty much a guarantee. I don't even know if it was maybe even a gimmick. The site was looking for some capital. I mean, I know Bet Online's been around forever, but it's interesting how that plays out, with EV. Some of the other incredible long lays that I got was Maryland, minus 1,600, minus 1,850. Couldn't get much money down, but I got California at minus 1,600 for 4,000, and then a little bit of money at minus 1,800. Again, you can see these EVs here using 99.9. And then I think I also got something down on I don't know if it was Vermont or a little bit on New Jersey here too. I mean, these were basically just like almost guarantees. Oh, Rhode Island, minus 1400 Rhode Island. That's just money in the bank. But again, the EV was really only, 7%. Now, to wrap this up, on the day of the election, all my Bitcoin had been deployed, and I had made all these bets, 209,000 by the time the election started. A couple of days before, I was like, oh, I'm going to be done. But then I kept seeing the Florida line, go up from plus 140 all the way up to 196. So I kept throwing money down. But what ended up happening was that, and in conclusion, if I were to do this over again, I would have not bet at all until election day. Because what happened on election day was absolutely insanity. It was absolutely insane what happened on election day. Basically, as we go back here to this map, what happened was that Trump carried the South relatively quickly. And the New York Times actually put a needle out, different from 2016, where they put a needle out for the total chances to win the election. They put a needle out on Florida, Georgia, and I believe Texas. And right away, it was clear, even though now it's looking like Biden's going to win Georgia, actually, it's almost guaranteed. But at the time, the first hour, they had the needle at Texas, Florida, Georgia at Trump. And the thing with those southern states is that they counted the mail-in ballots early, or in their early voting also early, whereas some other states do it differently. So Trump started winning these southern states here right off the bat. And then the returns came in from some of these northern states. And I always felt that there was just no way that Biden was going to lose one of these states, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Like I said, if we went back to the polling, the averages on 538, it was absolutely insane. I mean, it was Wisconsin was 94, Michigan was 95. I just couldn't believe that Trump was going to win one of those states when, Nate Silver only projected 5 out of 100. And again, this was because it was 95 out of 100 because the polls were so far in Biden's favor. And of course, Biden ended up carrying those states. But what ended up happening was that the states started coming back with returns heavy on Trump, like with only 15 or 20% of the vote counted, Trump was up by like 10 points. The reason for that discrepancy, though, was because the mail-in ballots weren't counted, or they didn't start to be able to be counted until election day. So those returns were reflecting the in-person voting. So the markets went absolutely insane, to the point where when Biden was at the beginning of the election about minus 190, as we go back and we can actually look at sort of my aggregate here by state. Let's see, I had national here. For the most part, it was, I got pretty good prices, minus 175, something like that. About 2 or 3 hours into the election, Biden ended up flipping to plus 400 in some places, and Trump was about minus 750. And that was solely because of the fact that he carried the South and people were looking at these northern states like he was losing, when in fact it wasn't really accurate of anything. I was on a different Market Mania live stream video, and I'll link to that in the description, where they had me on in the beginning and then they called me back in the middle where the odds were jumping up to Trump like 3 or 4 to 1 favorite. And I said, I still think this is a flip. It's 50-50. At that time, there was some very good news coming out of Maricopa County in Arizona. And I knew that in order for Biden to win, he actually didn't need to win Pennsylvania. As long as he carried Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and he won Nevada and Arizona, and also the single Nebraska district, the Nebraska 2nd, he would win. He didn't even need to win Pennsylvania. So when there was no data that was coming in that he was going to lose these states, and there was good news coming in from Arizona and Nevada, I was like, whoa, something is way, way off. And if I had it to do over again, I would have just absolutely pounded Biden at plus 300, plus 400. Some people followed my advice at the time, and they won big. By the way, the other sweep state that was looking good for Trump was Ohio. So Trump was basically looking like he was going to win Texas, Florida, and Ohio. And they had said it looked like Georgia, even though that's not the case. And now in retrospect, it looks like Biden's going to win Georgia, Arizona, Pennsylvania, and of course he's carried all these states. And it's not really even going to be close. To be perfectly honest, it's going to be, let's take a look here at the predictions of Nate Silver, sort of the average. He said that Biden was going to win 348, and it looks like he's going to win about 321. By the way, too, the national popular vote, 538 had weighted at about 8 points. It's right now about 3.4. This is national Biden, but a lot of states haven't counted that are going to be heavily favored towards Biden, like California and some of the mail-in. So it wouldn't surprise me if that number went up to 4 or 5. So, the polls are not as off as people thought. The polls are not as off as what people thought. Let's take a look here again at this sort of difference here. Some of the battlegrounds were definitely off, but again, the projections of Nate Silver sort of, kind of took that into effect. He was wrong about Florida. And I think, what I would say and again, if I were to do this over, or perhaps just looking from the outside where possibly some of his modeling is flawed, is not taking into account how poorly some polls do in certain states historically. Like, for example, Florida. We see polling errors in Florida, it seems like constantly, over and over again. It's just like these polls cannot correctly capture the demographics. So if you were to go over and look at Florida, and you were to look at, say, the weighted average of the polls in Florida, again, this is all, at 538, and Biden was up by 2.5, and Nate said that was 69 of 100, maybe it's only 50. It wasn't really 69 out of 100, it was 50-50. I mean, this is where I put a ton of money down on Florida because I thought that there was great value. Also, too, in Ohio, he had Biden 45 out of 100. The polling averages were pretty much like a dead heat, and then Trump ended up, winning by, say, 5 points. So, maybe Biden should have been much, much less. But again, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, where he was at 95, he all won those, and also, too, in Pennsylvania. Those were the ones, and also to Texas. I put a lot of money down on Texas, Ohio, Florida, and I thought I was getting some really good value in Alaska. The polls were very far off on the heavily Republican states where there wasn't really good polling. So, for him to say that Montana was 18 out of 100, and then it ended up being that, Trump won by like 15 or 16 points was when it obviously wasn't really that close. So that's kind of where I lost out a little bit. And I do wonder if he will actually, they ended up modeling Montana 538 weighted polls were minus 4.4, meaning that Trump was ahead by 4.4. And then the result was 16.3. So that's really where, I would change it up. But I think the most amount of money to be won really is actually waiting till Election Day, because I think that markets are irrational, specifically when it comes to politics betting. There just really aren't the types of sharps that you'll see in sports betting. There aren't syndicates. This type of thing only happens like once, every 4 years, and people are betting with emotion and betting with their heart. And I knew this scenario was going to play out. It was actually talked about on the 538 podcast many times, where Trump could win the South. The returns in the North are going to come in. It's going to look Trump, but they haven't counted the mail-in ballots yet because they count them in a different way. I find this map to be extremely, extremely interesting. This is over on New York Times Interactive's shift from 2016. So this represents the difference between the votes that Trump got in 2016 versus Hillary and what Trump got versus Biden. The red means that Trump got more votes, and the blue means that Biden got more votes than Hillary. Here's a couple things that just absolutely I find incredible about this, if you're into the sort of this voting stuff. The Latino vote in southern Florida went massively Trump's way. Trump got 22 points more than he did in 2016 in Miami-Dade County. In some of these border counties in Texas, down here and towards the west, this is obviously a small county, he got 55 points more in Starr County than he did in 2016. Absolutely incredible. The political scientists are going to be looking at this. Why did the Latino vote push towards Trump? On the other stuff, in terms of the red here, that I find interesting is that sort of rural white areas went for Trump, like Utah, Idaho, and a lot of Ohio. And then, of course, a lot of the southish type states like Arkansas, Oklahoma, which traditionally goes there, went even more for Trump. So, and southern Iowa too. So these are sort of like rural whites. So Trump really, really hit the rural whites a little bit even harder than he did in 2016. And for whatever reason, the Latino communities down here in the South. Now let's look at the blue though. Let's take a look here at the big blue movements. And you can see here a little bit of patchwork. Obviously, Georgia was a huge, huge part of this race. Suburban Atlanta, there's a lot of suburbs. Blue, blue, blue. Northern Virginia, that's like suburban DC, heavily, heavily blue. Colorado, which is a lot of white people, but it's not sort of as rural as you would see some areas, much more blue. Cities in Texas, Austin, San Antonio area, Minneapolis, more so of New England here too. So you're really looking at suburban white voters going towards Biden, rural white voters going even more towards Trump, and then Latinos going towards Trump. That was kind of the story. But yeah, I mean, Georgia here, I mean, this is an incredible shift here. Northern Virginia, and around here was somewhat the same, but, the blue sort of held. It's interesting here that rural South Dakota was a little bit more blue. Sometimes they tend to be a little bit more liberal out there. And then, of course, over here, the Northwest went more blue, and obviously New England. But, Trump's going to have to find a way to, or excuse me, the Democrats going to figure out a way why Trump carried so many Latino votes. A couple other things about this too. What I didn't mention here was PredictIt. PredictIt is a market where anyone can bet. You don't need Bitcoin. You can deposit through a credit card. It's a market. And also, by the way, it is also similar to what we're talking about. It's basically a probability, like you're buying a share price. So 50-50 would be like 50 cents. There's two results. You win or you lose. At the end, if you win, your share is worth $1. And if you lose, your share is worth $0. So these were some of the share prices on different markets. Like you could have bought, Biden, Wisconsin at 73 cents. And then this was a more complex formula, because the thing with PredictIt is that they charge you 10% on your profit and then a 5% withdrawal fee. So you have to factor all that stuff in. Another story about PredictIt is that, and then also too, in some other areas as well, right now I'm recording this on November 12th, and Trump could be as little as 8-1 or 9-1 win the election, but they're not real markets, because on PredictIt, you can only have 5,000 contracts. It's capped. Like you can only have 5,000 contracts of one market. So right here, you can see Trump 14 cents, which would basically suggest that if you're buying Trump at 14 cents, I'm dividing 14 into 100, 7.14. So you're making 6.14 to 1. Like this is the equivalent of, betting Trump at plus 614, which is just insane. But it's not a real market, because no one can actually go in and buy that or buy Biden at 89 cents because the contracts are capped. All the other sort of offshore sort of book sites have also taken down all their lines. So when you see these lines, they're not necessarily, real lines. And, people have contacted me because of my prediction stuff about being correct on election day. And they had said, oh, we should do this like on other elections. But this is like a once in every 4-year type of thing. Really is my conclusion. And the markets definitely move irrational, because so many people are really, betting with emotion. And, there's one other story that I find somewhat interesting here in this whole sort of betting political scene. And that is the bookmakers and how lucky they are, or they will be, with Bitcoin. Because when you deposit money into a site, most people in the US are using basically Bitcoin, right? And here's how it works. Like if I want to deposit, say, $1,000 onto a site, I send them $1,000 in Bitcoin. They immediately transfer it to dollars. So they immediately transfer it to dollars. Now, if they hold the Bitcoin for several months, and let's say Bitcoin goes up by 50%, which it did And let's say I break even. So let's say I put some bets and I break even. So I deposit $1,000 and now I'm going to withdraw $1,000. Well, when I go to withdraw, I'm going to get $1,000 back. But because the price of Bitcoin has gone up, I get less Bitcoin back. It doesn't affect me as the consumer. But if the sites are holding a lot of Bitcoin, for withdrawals, for deposits, things like that, they've actually made out really, really big. Now, it can work totally both ways. The price of Bitcoin could have gone down too, but this was the most heavily betted sort of market in the history of all the online books, and it just happens to be that Bitcoin went up by 50% during that time. So these books have actually made a lot of money on the sort of the volatility of Bitcoin. But I ended up putting, about 100 hours into this whole thing. I am a professional gambler. I learned a lot about writing Excel formulas. I learned a lot about how American odds work, especially when you lay an EVs and expectation and where markets move. So overall, even though I only ended up winning about $3,900, I think it was an overall good learning process for me as well. And I definitely think that that polling is a useful tool, and I think that Nate Silver is a sharp guy, and I think his model is pretty decent as long as he continues to make adjustments to it and learn from the past.